The bank manager slid a single sheet across the table and quietly said, "Miss Coleman, the wire transfer was returned before the money reached its destination." If the transfer had failed, who tried to send my entire $150,000 business fund? Why did the authorization carry my own signature? And why was my brother's construction company listed as the recipient? My parents had insisted everything they asked me to sign was routine family paperwork, but the red stamp reading returned pending investigation told me this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was proof that someone had already crossed a line I never imagined my own family would cross. If you're listening from somewhere in the world today, tell me what country you're watching from and what your local time is. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you appreciate realistic stories about family trust justice and rebuilding after betrayal, I'd love to have you subscribe and join me for the rest of this journey. 5 months before I found myself staring at that red compliance stamp inside the bank, my life looked almost painfully ordinary. I was 34 years old, living in Charlotte, North Carolina, and working as a senior operations manager for a regional logistics company. Most people imagined logistics as trucks, warehouses, and shipping labels. What I actually did was solve problems before they became expensive. Delayed shipments, inventory shortages, supplier disputes, transportation bottlenecks. I spent every day studying details that other people overlooked. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well. More importantly, it taught me something that would eventually save me from losing everything. Never assume, always verify. For 8 years, I lived below my means. I drove the same Honda Accord I had owned since my late 20s. My apartment overlooked a busy intersection instead of a lake. I skipped luxury vacations. I packed lunches. Every annual bonus went into the same business savings account. That account had one purpose. Someday, I would leave corporate America and start my own logistics consulting firm. By the beginning of that spring, the balance had finally reached $150,000. When I checked it each month, I didn't see money. I saw freedom. Freedom to choose my clients. Freedom to build something that belonged to me. Freedom to stop working 60-hour weeks making someone else's company more profitable. Only a handful of people knew about that account. My CPA, Olivia Grant. My financial advisor, and unfortunately, my parents. I never meant to tell them the exact amount. It happened during Sunday dinner. My mother, Patricia Coleman, had asked the innocent question parents often ask. "So when are you finally opening your own company?" "I've almost saved enough," I answered. "How much is almost?" my father Richard asked with a smile. I laughed. "You two sound like auditors." "We're your parents," Mom replied. "We're allowed to be curious." I hesitated. "About 150. Dad nodded. 150,000. Close. Both of them exchanged a quick glance. At the time, I interpreted it as pride. Looking back, it was calculation. My older brother Marcus arrived 20 minutes later carrying 2 pizzas and wearing the same confident grin he always seemed able to produce regardless of what was happening in his life. Marcus owned a residential construction company. For years, he'd been the family entrepreneur, the risk taker, the dreamer, the favorite. Whenever Marcus succeeded, everyone celebrated. Whenever Marcus failed, everyone was expected to help. Growing up, I rarely questioned it. Marcus broke a window with a baseball. Boys make mistakes. Marcus dropped out of community college. School isn't for everyone. Marcus borrowed money from relatives. He's investing in his future. Meanwhile, my achievements were expected. Good grades, scholarships, stable career, financial responsibility. Those weren't celebrated. They were simply what Leilani was supposed to do. It wasn't resentment anymore. It was simply the family dynamic I had learned to navigate. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Marcus talked about a new housing development his company hoped to finish before summer. Dad asked questions about lumber prices. Mom refilled everyone's drinks. Then Marcus sighed dramatically. "The market's getting rough." "What happened?" I asked. "3 buyers backed out." Dad frowned. "Temporary setback." Marcus shrugged. "Cash flow's tight." Mom immediately leaned forward. "But you're going to pull through." "I always do." The conversation moved on, or at least I thought it had. Over the next several weeks, Marcus's business became the subject of almost every family conversation. A supplier wasn't getting paid, a project had stalled, interest rates were hurting contractors, employees needed reassurance. Each story painted Marcus as hardworking but unlucky, never irresponsible, never reckless, always the victim of circumstances. One Saturday afternoon, Mom invited me over for coffee. She placed a mug in front of me before saying almost casually, "Your brother just needs one good break." I smiled politely. "I'm sure he'll figure it out. He always lands on his feet. Eventually." She watched me carefully. "You've always been so responsible." There it was, the compliment that usually came before the request. "I've been lucky," I answered. "No," she corrected. "You've been disciplined." I thanked her. Then she asked, "Is all your business money still sitting in one account?" The question felt oddly specific. "Yes." "Same bank?" "Yes." "Earning decent interest?" I laughed. "Mom." "What?" "You suddenly sound very interested in banking." "I'm interested because I'm your mother." It wasn't unreasonable. Parents ask questions. Families talk about finances. I answered without thinking much about it. When I met Olivia for lunch 2 days later, I mentioned the conversation while we waited for salads. She raised one eyebrow. "They asked where the money was." "Basically." "And you told them—" "I didn't give them the account number." "You didn't have to." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "People think financial fraud only starts with passwords." She stirred her iced tea. "It usually starts with information." I smiled. "You've watched too many crime documentaries." She smiled back. "Maybe." Then her expression became serious. "Just be careful." "I trust my parents." "I know." She paused. "I'm saying you don't have to trust everyone else's decisions." I changed the subject. At the time, her warning felt unnecessary. 2 weeks later, Marcus showed up driving a newer pickup truck. Not brand new, but certainly newer than the aging vehicle he'd been complaining about. "Business picking up?" I asked. He grinned. "Things are looking better." "I thought cash flow was tight." He shrugged. "Sometimes opportunities appear." Dad immediately interrupted. "See, we told you he'd bounce back." The confidence in the room felt strange, almost rehearsed. Everyone suddenly seemed relaxed. No more conversations about unpaid suppliers, no more worried phone calls, no more dramatic sighs over dinner. Marcus wasn't acting like someone whose company had nearly collapsed. He acted like someone who already knew help was coming. I couldn't explain why that bothered me. I only knew it lingered in the back of my mind longer than it should have. A few days later, my mother called. "Sweetheart, could you stop by Saturday?" "For what?" "We're updating a few family records." "What kind of records?" "Oh, nothing exciting." She laughed softly. "Just routine paperwork your father wants everyone to sign." "What paperwork?" "Old family documents." There was a brief pause. "It'll only take a few minutes." I looked at my calendar. "I can stop by after lunch." "Perfect." Before hanging up, she added one sentence that wouldn't mean anything until months later. "Bring your reading glasses if you still need them." I laughed. "I don't even wear reading glasses." "Well," she said with another little laugh, "just don't rush through the paperwork." At the time, it sounded like harmless advice. Months later, sitting across from Rebecca Mitchell inside that bank office, those words echoed in my head with terrifying clarity. Because somewhere inside those routine family documents was the signature now sitting on top of a wire transfer I had never authorized. And for the first time, I began wondering whether my parents had invited me over that Saturday for family paperwork, or for something they had planned long before I ever walked through their front door. Saturday arrived warm and unusually quiet. My parents lived in the same brick colonial house where my brother and I had grown up. Every visit felt familiar in the comforting way only childhood homes can. The maple tree in the front yard was taller than I remembered. My father's old wind chime still hung near the porch. Even the faded welcome mat was the same one my mother insisted was too sentimental to replace. Nothing about that afternoon suggested it would become one of the most expensive visits of my life. Mom greeted me with a hug before I even reached the front door. "I'm so glad you came." "I said I would." "I know," she smiled. "Sometimes work steals you away." Inside, Dad was arranging folders across the dining room table. Marcus was already there, leaning back in a chair, scrolling through his phone. "Look who finally decided we're worth visiting," he joked. "I saw you 3 weeks ago." "That's practically a year in corporate time." I laughed and sat down. The atmosphere felt unusually relaxed. There wasn't any obvious tension. No one looked nervous. If anything, everyone seemed almost relieved that I had shown up. Mom disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying iced tea and a plate of homemade cookies. "Let's eat first," she said. "Paperwork later." For nearly an hour, nothing important happened. We talked about baseball. Dad complained about rising insurance premiums. Mom discussed a neighborhood charity event. Marcus described one of his remodeling projects. It felt so ordinary that I briefly forgot why I'd come. Then Marcus sighed dramatically. "I almost lost another contract this week." Dad looked concerned. "What happened?" "The client couldn't secure financing." Mom shook her head. "This economy is hurting good people." Marcus looked toward me. "You ever think about investing?" I smiled politely. "In what?" "My company." There it was. The conversation I'd expected. "I thought you said things were improving." "They are. But growth takes capital." "I don't invest in businesses I don't understand." "You understand mine." "I understand construction." I took a sip of tea. "I don't understand your books." Marcus leaned forward. "I'd show you everything." "I appreciate that. But my savings already have a purpose." Mom spoke before Marcus could. "Your business can wait 6 months." I looked at her. "Why?" "Marcus needs help now." I kept my voice calm. "And I need that money to start my company." Dad folded his hands together. "No one is asking you to give it away." Marcus nodded quickly. "I'd pay every dollar back." As soon as projects close, with interest." He smiled hopefully. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. If your business is healthy, why can't a bank finance it? Silence settled over the table. Marcus looked down. Dad cleared his throat. "Banks have gotten cautious." "I'm sure they have." I looked back at Marcus. "But they still lend to companies with strong financials." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom reached across the table. "Leilani, I love all of you." "I do." "But mixing family and business almost never ends well." Dad sighed. "You've always been practical. I take that as a compliment." "It wasn't." His tone wasn't angry, just disappointed. Marcus stood. "I need some air." He walked onto the back patio. Mom watched him through the window. "He's under so much pressure." "I know." "He barely sleeps." "I know." You've always been the strong one. There it was again. The role I'd been assigned years ago. Marcus was fragile. I was resilient. Marcus deserved protection. I could absorb disappointment. Mom lowered her voice. Sometimes the strongest person carries a little more. I met her eyes. And eventually they break. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Dad finally stood and gathered a stack of folders. Let's get these family records finished. He placed 3 separate packets on the dining room table. Nothing complicated. I glanced through the first packet. Updated emergency contact information. Beneficiary confirmations for my parents' retirement accounts. A household inventory list for insurance purposes. Everything looked completely ordinary. I signed where appropriate. Dad collected those pages immediately and placed them into a separate folder. Then he handed me another packet. This one's just confirming we've reviewed old family records. I flipped through it. Several pages, mostly legal language. Nothing jumped out as unusual. One page near the back already had a small yellow sticky note attached. Sign here. I signed. Dad slid it away before I reached the following page. Next one. The pace felt oddly quick, not rushed enough to seem suspicious, just efficient enough that I didn't pause to question it. Mom kept talking while I signed. She asked about work, about vacation plans, about whether I was dating anyone. The conversation never stopped long enough for silence to settle. Looking back, I realized that wasn't accidental. Silence gives people time to read. Conversation keeps their attention divided. After another signature, I reached for the final page. Before I could turn it over, Richard gently rested his hand on the packet. That's everything. I thought there were more. Blank copies. They don't matter, he smiled. I always print extras. He slipped the packet into the folder with the others. The entire paperwork session lasted maybe 10 minutes. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable, nothing that felt criminal. Marcus returned from outside carrying his phone. He looked noticeably calmer. Crisis over, I joked. He smiled. Something like that. Dad clapped him on the shoulder. Things have a way of working themselves out. At the time, I assumed they were talking about one of Marcus's construction projects. Now I know they were talking about something entirely different. Before I left, Mom hugged me again. I'm proud of you. Thanks. You always help this family. The sentence struck me as odd. I didn't really do anything today. She smiled. You'd be surprised. Driving home, I couldn't explain why the afternoon lingered in my thoughts. Nothing specific bothered me. There wasn't one suspicious conversation, no obvious lie, no visible argument. Just a strange feeling that everyone had been waiting for something to happen. Over the next several weeks, life became busy again. Quarter-end reporting consumed my schedule. I met with my financial advisor to discuss business licensing. Olivia helped me compare commercial insurance policies. I barely thought about my parents' paperwork anymore. Then one Thursday afternoon, while leaving a client meeting, my phone vibrated. Charlotte Regional Bank security notification. Your signature has been verified for processing on a high-value account authorization. If you did not recently complete account documentation, please contact your financial institution. I stopped walking. My heart skipped once, then again. I stared at the notification. I hadn't visited the bank in weeks. I hadn't signed anything there. Assuming it was an automated verification delayed by paperwork from my financial advisor, I almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, I opened my banking app. Nothing looked different. The balance was exactly where it should be. No transfers, no withdrawals, no alerts. For a moment, I convinced myself it had to be a harmless system delay. Even so, I took a screenshot of the notification before dismissing it. A habit from years in operations. Document first. Assume later. I slipped my phone into my purse and walked toward the parking garage. I had no idea that screenshot would become one of the earliest pieces of evidence proving that someone had already begun using my signature for something I had never approved. The screenshot sat untouched in my phone for nearly 2 weeks, not because I forgot about it, because nothing else happened. No missing money, no unusual emails, no unexpected phone calls. Every time I logged into my business account, the balance remained exactly where it should be. $150,000. After a while, I convinced myself the notification had probably been generated by an old document finally making its way through the bank's system. It wasn't impossible. Large financial institutions processed thousands of documents every day. Sometimes paperwork was scanned days after it was signed. Sometimes automated alerts arrived late. Logic told me not to panic. Experience told me to verify anyway. On a Tuesday morning before work, I stopped by my local branch. The visit was supposed to take 10 minutes. Instead, it changed everything. Rebecca Mitchell greeted me with the kind of professional smile that made customers feel immediately at ease. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" I unlocked my phone and showed her the screenshot. "I received this notification a couple of weeks ago." She studied it. "When did you receive it?" I told her. "And you didn't authorize any account changes." "No." She looked back at the screen one more time before typing into her computer. "Give me just a moment." I sat quietly while she searched through several internal systems. Her expression remained neutral. Then I noticed something change. Her fingers stopped moving. She leaned slightly closer to the monitor. She clicked another window, then another. Without looking at me, she said softly, "Ms. Coleman." "Yes." "I'm going to ask someone from our operations department to review something." My stomach tightened. "Is there a problem?" "I don't know yet." That wasn't the answer I wanted. She disappeared through a secured door carrying a tablet. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When she returned, she wasn't alone. A man wearing a navy jacket with the bank's compliance badge introduced himself. "Good morning, Miss Coleman. I'm Stephen Walsh from Compliance." Compliance. That word alone made my pulse quicken. He smiled politely. "We just have a few questions." We moved into a private office away from the lobby. Rebecca closed the door behind us. Stephen sat across from me. "Can you confirm that this is your primary business savings account?" "Yes." "And you're the only authorized signer?" "Yes." "No business partners?" "No." He nodded. "Have you signed any banking documents recently?" "Not at the bank." "Anywhere else?" I thought for a moment. "Only some family paperwork at my parents' house." Rebecca and Stephen exchanged a glance so brief that most people would have missed it. I didn't. "What kind of paperwork?" Stephen asked. "I honestly don't know." "They said they were updating family records." "When was that?" I gave him the approximate date. He wrote it down. Then he asked something that caught me completely off guard. "Do you still have copies?" "No." They kept everything. Neither of them said anything for several seconds. Finally, Rebecca turned her monitor toward herself again. "I'd like to print something." She disappeared once more. When she came back, she carried a thin file. She didn't immediately hand it to me. Instead, she placed it on the table and opened it herself. Inside were several scanned pages. Most were routine account authorization forms. Then she stopped on one page. "Is this your signature?" I leaned closer. It was, without question, every curve, every letter, every small flourish beneath my last name. "Yes." Rebecca turned the page. "Do you recognize this document?" I stared at it. "No." The signature looked genuine. The document didn't. At the top was a banking authorization requesting approval for a high-value wire transfer from my business account. I had never seen that form before. "I didn't sign this?" Rebecca looked carefully at me. "You're certain?" "I signed my name." I pointed toward the page. "But not this document." Stephen folded his hands together. "Can you explain that?" "I can't." I looked closer. Something felt wrong. Not the signature. The page itself, the spacing around my signature, looked unusually wide. The margins above it seemed different from the rest of the form. I couldn't explain why. Only that years of reviewing contracts and shipping documentation had trained my eyes to notice when layouts didn't quite match. I stopped. "What?" "I think my signature belongs on another page." Rebecca looked interested. "What makes you say that?" "The formatting." I pointed toward the lower portion. "The signature line feels disconnected." Stephen leaned closer. "Can you elaborate?" "The text above it is compressed. The blank space below it is unusually large. The alignment isn't consistent. I review contracts almost every day. It looks like 2 different pages became one. Neither of them responded immediately. Instead, Stephen carefully wrote another note. Rebecca quietly excused herself again. This time she returned carrying a much thicker file. She laid several printed copies across the conference table. "I requested the imaging history." I looked at her. "The what?" "Our document archive stores every version that passes through imaging." She placed 3 nearly identical pages beside one another. At first glance, they looked exactly the same. Then Rebecca pointed toward the bottom corner. "Creation date!" The first copy had been scanned in February. The second copy showed March. The third showed April. Yet the signature on every version appeared identical. Exactly identical. Not simply similar. Pixel for pixel. Even the smallest ink marks matched perfectly. I felt my stomach drop. "That's impossible?" Stephen nodded slowly. "It certainly deserves an explanation." Rebecca printed one final page. Unlike the others, this wasn't a document. It was a system log. Rows of dates, times, employee IDs, scanner numbers, file revisions. She explained everything carefully. "When customers sign documents in the branch, our imaging system records when each page is scanned." She pointed to one entry. "This signature page entered the archive on March 14th. Then another. The remaining authorization pages weren't scanned until April 2nd. I frowned. So they shouldn't exist as one completed document if they entered the system on different dates." Silence filled the room. I finally whispered, "Someone reused my signature." Stephen didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the folder. "We don't reach conclusions before completing an investigation." He chose every word carefully. "But the timeline you've seen today raises legitimate questions." Rebecca looked directly at me. "I recommend you formally dispute this authorization." "I can do that now." "Immediately." She printed another packet. Unlike everything else I'd signed over the past few months, this one she encouraged me to read line by line. I did. Every page, every paragraph, every signature block. When I finished, I signed the dispute affidavit. Rebecca notarized it before making certified copies. Stephen added the file to the compliance investigation. As we stood to leave, he stopped me at the door. "Miss Coleman." "Yes." "Until we understand exactly how these documents were assembled, we've placed a temporary administrative hold on any future high-value transfers involving this authorization." I exhaled for what felt like the first time all morning. "So the money is safe. For now." "For now." Those 2 words echoed in my head all the way to the parking lot. I had proof that my signature had likely been reused. I had a formal investigation. I had protected the account, but I still didn't know who had done it. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Daniel Foster, the business attorney Olivia had recommended months earlier. After listening carefully to everything that had happened, he remained quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Leilani, don't contact your parents yet." "I wasn't planning to." "Good. Let the documents tell the story before anyone has the chance to rewrite it." Then his voice grew more serious. "I've also received something this morning." "What?" "A notice from another financial institution requesting verification related to Marcus Coleman's construction company." I tightened my grip on the phone. "What does that mean?" Daniel answered carefully. "It means your family's paperwork may not be the only thing someone is asking questions about." Daniel asked me to come to his office the following morning instead of discussing anything over the phone. "The fewer assumptions we make now," he said before hanging up, "the stronger your position will be later." That sentence stayed with me all night. By then, I had stopped asking myself whether something was wrong. Something clearly was. The real question had become much more uncomfortable. How many people already knew? Daniel's office occupied the 6th floor of a renovated brick building overlooking downtown Charlotte. It wasn't flashy, no marble lobby, no oversized conference rooms, just shelves lined with legal binders, framed diplomas, and a receptionist who greeted every client by name. When I arrived, Daniel was already reviewing a stack of documents. Olivia sat beside him with her laptop open. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. Daniel motioned toward the chair across from him. "Let's build a timeline." He slid a legal pad across the desk. "We know you signed family paperwork sometime in March." I nodded. "We know your signature later appeared on a wire authorization." Another nod. "We know the signature page and the authorization pages entered the bank's imaging system on different dates." "Yes. And we know compliance froze the transaction before any money actually left your account." "So far." Daniel folded his hands. "Now we need to answer one question." "Who benefited?" Olivia turned her laptop so I could see the screen. She had organized everything into chronological order. Family dinner, the paperwork at my parents' house, the security notification, the disputed authorization, the compliance investigation. Seeing everything laid out so neatly made the pattern impossible to ignore. Every significant event pointed toward one destination. Marcus. Daniel spoke carefully. "People often assume financial fraud begins with greed. It doesn't. It usually begins with justification." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "If someone convinces themselves they're borrowing rather than stealing, or helping the family rather than harming someone, their own behavior starts to feel reasonable." He paused. "That's why motive matters." I thought about my parents. Neither of them had ever been criminals. Dad spent 35 years working for the county transportation department. Mom had been an elementary school teacher. They paid bills on time, volunteered at church, never missed birthdays, never missed anniversaries. Nothing about them fit the image people associate with fraud. Daniel seemed to read my thoughts. "This doesn't require your parents to be evil. It only requires them to convince themselves they had the right." That sentence hurt more than I expected, because it sounded possible. Olivia clicked open another folder. "I've been reviewing publicly available business filings." She looked toward me. "Marcus's company was in much worse shape than everyone admitted." She pointed to several documents. Outstanding supplier liens, late tax filings, a lawsuit from a subcontractor, equipment loans nearing default. I stared at the numbers. He never mentioned any of this. "Most struggling businesses don't," she continued. "If even one lender accelerated repayment, he could have lost the company within weeks." Suddenly, every family dinner conversation made sense. The dramatic sighs, the stories about difficult clients, the repeated reminders that Marcus just needed one more chance. They hadn't been random conversations. They had been preparation. Daniel stood and walked toward a whiteboard. He wrote 3 names: Patricia, Richard, Marcus. Then he drew arrows between them. "There are several possibilities." He pointed toward Patricia and Richard. "Your parents acted alone." Another arrow. "Marcus convinced them." Another. "They all participated together." He put the marker down. "Right now, we don't know which is true. And we won't guess." That was one thing I appreciated about Daniel. He never filled missing facts with speculation. He waited for evidence. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen before answering. Daniel Foster. He listened for nearly a minute, then thanked the caller and hung up. "That was the compliance investigator." My heart immediately started racing. "What did they find?" "They're still reviewing." He chose his words carefully. "But they shared something interesting." Olivia looked up. "The receiving bank rejected the wire." "I know. They rejected it for a specific reason." Daniel opened another folder. "The account information didn't fully match supporting documentation." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He explained it in simple language. When large wire transfers move between banks, especially 6-figure amounts, both institutions perform compliance checks. If information doesn't line up, names, business ownership, authorization, or supporting records, the receiving bank can pause or reject the transfer. So they thought something looked suspicious. They thought something looked inconsistent. That's different." He handed me a printed explanation from the bank. Certain portions had been redacted. The visible sections described an account ownership discrepancy requiring enhanced review. "So," I asked quietly, "if every document had matched," Daniel met my eyes, "the transfer likely would have gone through." For several seconds, nobody spoke. I imagined opening my banking app one morning and seeing my business account reduced to 0. 8 years. Gone. Not because of a hacker halfway around the world, because of my own family. Olivia finally broke the silence. "There's something else." She clicked another email onto the screen. "This came through Discovery." The sender was my mother. The recipient was Marcus. The subject line read, "We have to do this before she changes her mind." I felt my chest tighten. Daniel slid the printed copy toward me. "We're allowed to review this because it was voluntarily produced during the bank's internal inquiry." I read slowly. Patricia wrote that Leilani was becoming too independent. She worried I would leave my corporate job before Marcus recovered financially. She believed my savings represented the family's last opportunity to help him. Then came one sentence I read 3 times. "If we wait until she starts her company, she'll never agree." I closed my eyes. Mom hadn't believed I would willingly help Marcus. She had already accepted that. Instead, she had started looking for another way. "There are more," Olivia said gently. Another email. Dad asking Marcus whether his accountant had finished preparing financial projections. Another. Marcus replying that once the funds arrived, several immediate problems would disappear. None of the emails explicitly discussed forging documents. None instructed anyone to commit fraud, but together they revealed something impossible to ignore. They had been planning around my refusal. Daniel summarized it carefully. "These emails don't prove how the authorization was created. They do show everyone expected your money to become available." I leaned back in my chair. "I don't understand. My parents always taught me honesty mattered." Daniel answered quietly, People often abandon principles gradually. They rarely wake up one morning deciding to cross a legal line. They convince themselves each small step is temporary, then necessary, then justified. My phone buzzed. Mom. I stared at the screen until the call stopped. A text arrived seconds later. Dinner Sunday. We miss you. Nothing else. No mention of banks. No mention of paperwork. No mention of investigations. Just dinner. As though nothing had happened. I looked at Daniel. Should I answer? He shook his head. Not yet. Eventually. Yes. But not until we know exactly what happened. Before I could respond, Rebecca Mitchell called. I put the phone on speaker. Ms. Coleman, this is Rebecca. Hi. I wanted to let you know compliance completed another review this afternoon. My stomach tightened. What did they find? The wire transfer wasn't canceled by your parents. It wasn't canceled by Marcus. It was automatically returned by the receiving bank after enhanced verification failed, so nobody changed their mind. No. Rebecca hesitated. If the receiving institution hadn't questioned the documentation, your $150,000 would almost certainly have been deposited into your brother's company account. I closed my eyes. The room became completely silent. Daniel slowly lowered his pen. Olivia stopped typing. Rebecca spoke one final sentence before ending the call. I know this may not feel fortunate today, Ms. Coleman, but another bank's decision may have saved your future. I didn't sleep much after Rebecca's phone call, not because I was afraid anymore, because fear had been replaced by something quieter. Grief. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing the people who taught you right from wrong may have convinced themselves that different rules applied when the money belonged to you. For days I replayed ordinary childhood memories in my head. Dad teaching me how to balance my first checking account. Mom reminding me to always tell the truth even when it was difficult. Neither memory matched the people I was dealing with now. Daniel warned me not to confuse emotion with evidence. The facts are moving in your favor, he said. Don't interrupt that process by forcing a confrontation too early. A week later, his office received a request from the Coleman's attorney. They wanted mediation, not court, not depositions. Mediation. They're hoping to settle this quietly, Daniel explained. Why now? Because they finally understand the bank isn't treating this as a misunderstanding. I looked at him, and if I refuse, then we continue toward litigation. He let that settle for a moment. Mediation doesn't require you to compromise. It simply gives everyone one opportunity to explain themselves. I agreed. Not because I expected an apology, because I wanted to hear what they believed had happened. The mediation took place in a neutral office building across town. No courtroom, no judge, just a conference room with a long wooden table, bottled water, legal pads, and a retired attorney serving as the mediator. When I walked in, my parents were already seated. Marcus arrived a minute later. No one smiled, no one hugged. No one asked how I'd been. That alone told me everything had changed. The mediator introduced himself and reviewed the ground rules. Everyone would have an opportunity to speak, no interruptions. Everything discussed would remain confidential unless independently admissible elsewhere. Once he finished, he looked toward my parents. Who would like to begin? My mother spoke first. Her voice trembled. Leilani. I never wanted any of this. I listened without responding. We were trying to save your brother. I know. He would have lost everything. I know. You've always been successful. There it was again, the same sentence I'd heard my entire adult life, as though success somehow reduced my right to decide what happened to my own money. She continued, You had options. He didn't. I folded my hands together, So the solution was to use my business fund. She looked down. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I asked quietly, what way was it supposed to happen? She didn't answer. Instead, my father leaned forward. We intended to explain everything afterward. Daniel made a note. I looked directly at Dad. After what? After Marcus stabilized. You mean after my money was already gone? Richard sighed heavily. We believed he'd repay it. With interest. Marcus finally spoke. I fully intended to. I turned toward him. As soon as projects closed. The same projects your lenders believed couldn't keep your business alive. He looked away. Nobody answered. The mediator gently redirected the conversation. Let's focus on the decisions that were actually made. Daniel slid several documents across the table. The timeline, the scanner records, the email chain. Nobody disputed their authenticity. Instead, Dad tried another approach. This family has always helped one another. I nodded slowly. Give me one example. He looked confused. One example of Marcus sacrificing something significant for me. Silence. Mom searched for an answer. Marcus stared at the table. I waited. Finally, Dad said, That's not the point. It is the point. I kept my voice calm. For years, helping this family meant helping Marcus. When I succeeded, I was responsible. When Marcus struggled, everyone became responsible. No one disagreed, because no one could. The mediator looked toward Marcus. Would you like to respond? Marcus took a long breath. I never asked Mom and Dad to steal anything. That sentence hung in the room. Daniel immediately wrote it down. I noticed Marcus watching him. What? Marcus asked. Daniel looked up. I like recording exact wording. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I never asked them to commit fraud. So you knew money was being moved? Daniel asked. Marcus hesitated. I knew they were trying to help. Did you believe Leilani had agreed? Another pause. I assumed. Daniel waited. You assumed what? Marcus rubbed his forehead. I assumed they'd convinced her. Before or after you received the wire confirmation? Marcus looked up too quickly. What wire confirmation? The room went quiet. Daniel calmly opened another folder. Interesting question. Marcus realized his mistake almost immediately. He had denied knowledge of a document no one else had mentioned. Daniel slid a printed email across the table. It had been produced during discovery. The sender was Marcus's office manager. Attached was a copy of the incoming wire notification generated before the receiving bank rejected the transfer. The timestamp was 3 days before I ever learned anything had happened. Daniel spoke evenly. Your office received notification that a $150,000 wire was pending. Marcus didn't touch the document. I forgot. You forgot a pending $150,000 transfer. I had a lot going on. Daniel didn't argue. He simply wrote another note. Sometimes silence is more uncomfortable than accusation. The mediator asked for a short break. As everyone stood, my mother approached me. Can we talk privately? I looked toward Daniel. He gave a slight nod. We stepped into the hallway. For the first time all morning, she looked less like my mother and more like someone carrying unbearable regret. Tears filled her eyes. We thought we'd fix everything before you ever noticed. I stared at her. You thought I wouldn't notice $150,000 disappearing? We thought Marcus would replace it before I launched my business. Her silence answered the question. You knew exactly why I saved that money. She nodded. I also knew your brother would lose everything. And that mattered more. No. Her voice cracked. It felt more urgent. I looked at her for several seconds. Urgent doesn't erase permission. She began crying. I know. Do you... She wiped her face. We're asking you to stop this. Please. If this becomes public, your father could lose his reputation. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because even now, she wasn't asking me to stop because what they had done was wrong. She was asking because other people might find out. I answered as gently as I could. I didn't create this situation. You did. When we returned to the conference room, the mediator asked whether anyone wished to make additional statements before concluding the session. Dad slowly raised his hand. He looked exhausted, older than I had ever seen him. Then he said the sentence that changed the direction of the entire case. I knew Leilani never approved the final wire paperwork. The room froze. He seemed to realize what he'd said only after the words had left his mouth. Mom turned toward him in shock. Marcus whispered, Dad. Daniel remained perfectly still. Then in the calmest voice imaginable, he asked, Mr. Coleman, would you mind repeating that statement for the official mediation record? My father closed his eyes. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The mediator didn't interrupt. Daniel didn't repeat the question. He simply waited. One of the first things I'd learned from working in operations was that people often reveal more when no one rushes to fill the silence. Eventually, Dad opened his eyes again. He looked toward my mother, then at Marcus. Finally, he looked at me. I said I knew Leilani never approved the final wire paperwork. Daniel nodded once. Thank you. He didn't celebrate. He didn't sound triumphant. He simply wrote the statement down exactly as my father had said it. The mediator asked another question. For clarity, Mr. Coleman, are you saying your daughter never reviewed the completed wire authorization before it was submitted? Yes. And you were aware of that at the time? Dad swallowed. Yes. Across the table, Marcus shifted in his chair. His attorney leaned over and whispered something to him. Mom covered her face with one hand. For the first time since this began, no one was trying to convince me that everything had been a misunderstanding. The facts had become too difficult to avoid. The mediation ended less than 30 minutes later. No settlement was reached. As Daniel and I walked toward the elevator, he remained unusually quiet. Finally, I asked, was that as important as it sounded? He smiled slightly. It was more important. Why, because until today, we had strong documentary evidence. He pressed the elevator button. Now we have an admission. But he didn't admit to creating the paperwork. He didn't have to. Daniel looked at me. He admitted he knew you hadn't approved it. That changes how every other piece of evidence will be viewed. A week later, the formal discovery process accelerated. The bank completed its internal investigation. Compliance had preserved every electronic record connected to the attempted transfer, the scanner logs, the document revisions, the employee access history, the imaging archive, everything. Daniel invited me to review the findings before depositions began. He spread several enlarged printouts across the conference table. Remember when Rebecca showed you the different scan dates? Yes. Now we know why. He pointed to a timeline, March 18th. A single signature page entered the bank's imaging archive. April 4th. 3 additional authorization pages were uploaded. April 4th, 6 minutes later. A complete wire packet appeared. I frowned. So someone assembled them afterward. Exactly. Olivia opened another file. The imaging software keeps more information than most people realize. She explained it in plain English. Every scanned page carried hidden technical information. Scanner identification, creation timestamps, revision history, compression settings, When unrelated pages were combined later, those digital fingerprints often remained. "The pages don't age together," she said. "They tell their own story." That explanation was surprisingly comforting. Documents couldn't be pressured by guilt. Files didn't care about family loyalty. They simply existed, exactly as they had been created. Several days later, depositions began. Unlike mediation, depositions were formal. Everyone testified under oath. Every answer was recorded by a court reporter. Every inconsistency mattered. Rebecca Mitchell testified first. She calmly explained how high-value wire transfers were processed. She described the imaging system, the verification procedures, the compliance review. Most importantly, she explained why she became concerned. The signature itself wasn't suspicious. One of the attorneys asked, "So what was?" Rebecca answered without hesitation, "The document history." She explained how employees rarely noticed metadata during routine processing because the system assembled completed packets automatically, but when compliance compared archived versions, the inconsistencies became obvious. "Did Ms. Coleman report the issue before the transfer was completed?" "Yes." "Did she cooperate throughout the investigation?" "Completely." "Did she ever change her explanation?" "No." Her testimony lasted less than an hour. It was calm, technical, objective, exactly the kind of witness every jury tends to trust. Next came Stephen Walsh from compliance. He explained enhanced verification in simple language. Large financial institutions, he said, monitored unusual transactions constantly. Six-figure transfers, new recipients, recently verified signatures, business accounts without previous wire activity. Any combination of those factors could trigger additional review. Marcus's attorney asked, "So your department accused my client of fraud?" Stephen answered immediately, "No." "What did you conclude?" "We concluded the documentation required additional investigation." "Why?" "Because portions of the authorization packet originated at different times." "Did that automatically prove misconduct?" "No. It proved inconsistency." I appreciated the way he answered. No exaggeration, no speculation, only facts. By the afternoon, it was Marcus's turn. He looked far less confident than he had during mediation. Daniel began politely. "Mr. Cole, when did you first learn $150,000 might be transferred into your company's account?" Marcus shifted. "I don't remember." Daniel placed a document in front of him. "Would reviewing this email refresh your memory?" Marcus glanced at it. His shoulders dropped slightly. "Yes." The office manager forwarded it. "When?" "The day before the transfer." "So you knew funds were expected?" "Yes." "What did you believe the source would be? My parents said they were helping." "Did you ask whether your sister had approved it?" Marcus hesitated. "I assumed she had." Daniel nodded. "You assumed." He slid another exhibit across the table. This one was a text message recovered during discovery. Marcus had written to a supplier funds should clear tomorrow. Hold off one more day. Daniel waited. "You were expecting those funds, weren't you?" "Yes." "Confident enough to reassure creditors?" Marcus looked down. "Yes." Then came the question that changed everything. "When the transfer failed, did you ask your sister why?" Marcus blinked. "No." "Why not?" He stopped. Daniel didn't help him. The silence stretched. Finally, Marcus answered, "Because I didn't think she knew." No one spoke, not even Marcus's own attorney. Daniel gently followed up. "If you believed your sister had authorized the transfer, why would you assume she didn't know it had failed?" Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. There wasn't a believable answer, because his own words had revealed something he'd been trying to avoid admitting. He hadn't expected me to know. Not before the money arrived, not before they had time to explain it away. The following morning, Daniel called me before I left for work. "I have one more witness." "Who?" "A woman named Karen Douglas." The name meant nothing to me. "Who is she?" "She worked as a temporary administrative assistant at your parents' accountant's office during tax season." "What does she know?" Daniel paused just long enough to make me pay attention. "She remembers assembling a packet of scanned documents." "Why is that important?" "Because she says she didn't realize one page belonged to a completely different document until investigators showed her the file months later." I felt my pulse quicken. "So she can identify who instructed her?" "Yes." "And according to her statement, that instruction didn't come from the bank." "It came from someone much closer to my family. Karen Douglas wasn't what I expected. When Daniel told me she had worked as a temporary administrative assistant, I imagined someone in her early 20s who had simply followed instructions without paying much attention. Instead, she was in her late 50s, calm, organized, the kind of person who remembered details because paying attention had been her profession for decades. By the time we met in Daniel's office, she had already given a sworn statement. She wasn't there to take sides. She was there to explain what she had seen. "I've worked in accounting offices for almost 30 years, she said. "Tax season gets hectic. Sometimes firms bring in temporary staff like me to organize paperwork, scan documents, and prepare client files." Daniel nodded. "Tell Ms. Coleman about the documents." Karen folded her hands. "I never reviewed their contents. That wasn't my job." "What was your job?" "I scanned pages exactly as clients requested." She looked at me apologetically. "I remember your father's file because he asked me to separate one signature page before rescanning several other documents." My chest tightened. "What exactly did he say?" "He told me the signature page had printed crooked and needed to be inserted into a cleaner copy." Daniel asked the next question. "Did that seem unusual?" "A little." "Why? Normally we'd rescan the entire document." "Not just one page," she continued. "I asked whether he wanted to bring back the original paperwork. He said he was in a hurry, so I followed his instructions." She took a slow breath. I honestly believed everything belonged together. Daniel placed 2 enlarged exhibits on the conference table. One was the signature page I had signed at my parents' dining room. The other was the completed wire authorization. Karen immediately pointed at the signature page. "That's the page I rescanned." Then she pointed toward the remaining authorization pages. "I never scanned those together." Silence settled over the room. She looked genuinely upset. "If I'd known..." She stopped herself. "I would have refused." I believed her. She hadn't hidden anything. She hadn't lied. She had simply trusted a longtime client, just as I had trusted my parents. When Karen left, Daniel closed the file. "Her testimony doesn't accuse anyone of creating fraudulent paperwork." "But it establishes something important." "What?" "Your father personally controlled the document assembly process." I stared at the table. "So he can't argue the paperwork simply arrived that way." "Exactly." 2 weeks later, both legal teams agreed to another settlement conference. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. No one talked about misunderstandings. No one claimed the bank had made a mistake. The discussion centered on responsibility. The mediator opened the meeting with a simple observation. "Since our last session, significant additional evidence has become available." No one disagreed. Daniel summarized the evidence without raising his voice. The document timeline, the scanner logs, the email chain, the compliance findings, Karen's testimony, my father's admission during mediation. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He was simply arranging the facts in chronological order. When he finished, the mediator looked toward my parents. "Would either of you like to respond?" My father spoke first. His shoulders seemed smaller than I remembered. "I made terrible decisions." He looked directly at me. I kept telling myself it wasn't permanent. I believed Marcus would recover. I believed we'd replace the money before you ever needed it. I asked quietly, "Did you ever consider asking me again?" He looked down. "We already knew your answer." There it was. Not desperation, not confusion. A decision. They had decided my answer no longer mattered. Mom reached for a tissue. "I kept telling your father we'd explain everything afterward." I looked at her. "You keep saying afterward." She nodded through tears. "I know." "No." I kept my voice calm. "I don't think you do." I leaned forward. "If the receiving bank hadn't rejected that transfer, when exactly were you planning to tell me?" Neither of them answered. The silence lasted almost a full minute. Finally, Mom whispered, "I don't know." That was the first completely honest answer I'd heard from her. Marcus had remained unusually quiet throughout the morning. Eventually, the mediator turned toward him. "Mr. Coleman," he rubbed his forehead before speaking. "I need to say something." Nobody interrupted. When Mom and Dad told me they were finding another way, I asked whether Leilani had changed her mind. He looked at me. "They said they'd handle it." I listened without reacting. I should have asked more questions. Instead, I accepted what I wanted to believe. Daniel asked one careful question. "You understood there was a chance your sister hadn't agreed?" Marcus closed his eyes. "Yes." "You accepted that risk?" Another pause. "Yes." I told myself I'd pay her back before she ever noticed. His voice cracked for the first time. "I convinced myself that made it different." I finally spoke. "No. It only made it easier for you to live with." Marcus didn't argue, because he couldn't. The mediator requested another short recess, while both legal teams discussed settlement terms. Daniel and I stepped into a smaller conference room. "They're ready to acknowledge liability," he said. "What happens now?" "You have choices." He laid out the options carefully. Continue toward trial, negotiate a civil settlement, require written admissions, seek reimbursement of legal costs, demand additional financial safeguards. You don't have to decide in the next 5 minutes. I thought about everything that had happened over the previous months, the paperwork, the emails, the lies, the guilt. Then I thought about something else. The future. "I don't need revenge." Daniel nodded. "I know. I need certainty." "What does certainty look like to you?" I answered without hesitation. "My business fund stays untouched." "Every acknowledgement becomes part of the written settlement." "They never have access to my financial information again." "And they stopped telling relatives this was all a misunderstanding." Daniel smiled faintly. "Those are boundaries." "Not punishment." When negotiations resumed, the attorneys spent hours refining language. By late afternoon, everyone had reached a tentative agreement. My parents would sign a written acknowledgement confirming I had never authorized the wire transfer. They would reimburse my legal expenses. They would formally withdraw every claim suggesting I had approved or consented to the transaction. Most importantly, they would acknowledge that all future financial decisions involving my assets required my express written authorization, and no family member had authority to act on my behalf. Before anyone signed, Marcus quietly asked if he could speak to me alone. Daniel looked at me. "The choice is yours." I agreed. We walked into the hallway outside the conference room. Marcus stood silently for several seconds before speaking. "I warned Mom and Dad the bank might reject the transfer." I looked at him. I know. I also warned them, he swallowed, that if it worked, there might not be any way to fix what happened between us. For the first time since this nightmare began, I believed he wasn't trying to defend himself. He was finally admitting that he'd understood the cost all along. The settlement became official 3 weeks later. By then, I had read every page at least 4 times. Not because I distrusted Daniel, because I had learned the hard way that signatures deserve more attention than assumptions. When we met in his office for the final review, he slid the completed agreement across the conference table. This is the last opportunity to change anything. I smiled faintly. I've become very good at reading paperwork. He laughed. I noticed. The agreement wasn't dramatic. There were no emotional speeches hidden inside legal language. Just facts. My parents acknowledged in writing that I had never authorized the attempted wire transfer. They agreed to reimburse my legal expenses. They withdrew every statement suggesting I had consented to moving my business fund. They also agreed that neither of them nor Marcus had any authority to request, approve, or represent decisions involving my personal finances in the future. It wasn't an apology. It was accountability. There was a difference. I signed first. Then Daniel signed as my attorney. Across town, my parents and Marcus signed with their own counsel present. When the last signature was completed, Daniel closed the folder. That's it. It doesn't feel like it. It rarely does. He leaned back in his chair. Legal cases end. Relationships recover at their own pace. For the first time in months, I walked out of his office without carrying a stack of documents. The following Monday, I submitted the final paperwork to launch my consulting company. For years, I'd imagined that day would be filled with excitement. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. No celebration, no champagne, just a quiet confidence that nothing was standing between me and the future I'd been building. My new office wasn't impressive. A modest suite overlooking a busy commercial district. 1 conference room, 2 desks, a whiteboard. Large windows that filled the space with afternoon sunlight. Olivia walked in carrying a small cardboard box. I brought housewarming gifts. Inside were coffee mugs, a notebook, a framed photo from our college graduation, and a small brass compass. I picked it up. What's this for? She smiled. So you'll always remember to choose your own direction. I laughed. That's surprisingly poetic for a CPA. I'm full of surprises. She looked around the office. You built this. No one handed it to you. I nodded. And no one gets to take it away. Business came slowly during the first month. Then referrals began arriving. One satisfied client recommended another. A regional distributor hired me to streamline warehouse operations. A manufacturing company asked me to redesign its transportation schedule. Within 6 months, I had replaced nearly all of my former corporate salary. Not overnight, not through luck. Through steady work, exactly the way I'd always hoped. One afternoon while reviewing invoices, my phone vibrated. Mom. I let it ring. Then it stopped. A voicemail notification appeared. I waited until the end of the day before listening. Hi, sweetheart. Her voice sounded tired. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I understand. She paused. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not because we signed papers, not because lawyers told me to, because I've had time to think. Another long pause. I spent so many years believing helping one child automatically justified asking more from the other. I never realized how unfair that had become. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I finally understand. The message ended. I sat quietly for several minutes. Olivia looked over from her desk. You okay? I don't know. Good apology. Better than the others. She waited. But it still doesn't change what happened. She nodded. Apologies explain the future. They don't rewrite the past. That sentence stayed with me. A few weeks later, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't from my mother. It was from my father. Inside was a handwritten letter. No legal language, no requests, no excuses. Just 3 pages. He admitted he'd spent months convincing himself he was protecting the family. In reality, he'd been protecting one child at the expense of another. He apologized for confusing responsibility with obligation. He admitted he had expected me to absorb the loss because I'd always managed to recover from disappointment before. Near the end, one sentence caught my attention. I kept calling you the strongest because it allowed me to ask the most from you. I read that sentence 3 times. It explained more about my childhood than years of family dinners ever had. Strength had become my family's excuse. If Leilani could handle it, then Leilani should sacrifice. That pattern ended the moment I decided my boundaries mattered as much as everyone else's needs. Several relatives eventually learned pieces of what had happened, not because I told them, because settlement records existed. Questions spread naturally. One evening, my aunt called. I heard there was some disagreement about money. There was. Your mother says the family worked everything out. I thought carefully before answering. We resolved the legal issues. And the family. I looked through my office window at the city lights. We're learning what healthy distance looks like. She didn't ask another question. I appreciated that. Not every detail belongs in every conversation. As autumn arrived, my business hired its first employee, then a second. The company I'd spent years imagining was finally becoming real. Not because everything in my life had become perfect, because I stopped waiting for perfect conditions before moving forward. Late one Friday afternoon, my assistant walked into my office carrying the day's mail. There's one personal envelope. I thanked her. The return address belonged to my parents. Inside was an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner. No emotional letter, no pressure, just a simple handwritten note. You're welcome if you'd like to come. We understand if you're not ready. I stared at the invitation for a long time. Not because I was deciding whether to forgive them. That decision was separate. I was deciding something much more practical. Could I spend one afternoon with people I no longer trusted, without abandoning the boundaries that had finally allowed me to heal? I left the Thanksgiving invitation on my kitchen counter for 3 days before making a decision. Not because I was undecided, because I wanted to be certain I was choosing out of peace, not guilt. For most of my life, family invitations had carried an invisible expectation. If you loved us, you came. If you cared, you helped. If someone needed something, you figured out how to provide it. This invitation felt different. For the first time, there was no pressure attached. No follow-up phone calls, no emotional messages, no reminders that family comes first. Just an invitation. That alone told me something had changed. I called my mother the Monday before Thanksgiving. Hi, Mom. There was the brief silence before she answered. Leilani. I got the invitation. I'm glad. I'll come. Another pause. Thank you. But I need you to understand something. I'm listening. I'm coming because I want to see everyone. I'm not coming because everything is back to normal. I know. If anyone brings up money, the lawsuit, or asks me for financial help, I'll leave. She answered immediately. I understand. And no one will. When I hung up, I realized something important. That was the first conversation we'd had in months without either of us trying to change the other's mind. Thanksgiving afternoon felt strangely familiar. The same house, the same maple tree, the same smell of roasted turkey drifting through the front door. But the atmosphere had changed. No one rushed to hug me. No one pretended nothing had happened. My father opened the door. "I'm glad you came." "So am I." He stepped aside. Inside, several relatives smiled politely. Conversation resumed naturally. No awkward announcements. No dramatic apologies. People simply treated me like an adult capable of deciding where I belonged. Dinner passed quietly. We talked about work, travel, football, my newest client. Marcus mentioned he'd accepted a project much smaller than the developments he used to chase. "I'm keeping things manageable," he said. "No more trying to grow faster than the business can support." Dad nodded. "Slow and steady." I noticed he wasn't speaking for Marcus anymore. Marcus was speaking for himself. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the back patio with a cup of coffee. The November air was cool enough that I pulled my coat tighter. A minute later, Marcus joined me. "I figured you'd want some fresh air." "I did." He leaned against the railing. "I've been meaning to tell you something." I waited. "I sold 2 trucks." I looked at him. "Why, I didn't need them. They were part of pretending the company was bigger than it really was." He laughed softly. "I spent years trying to impress people." "What changed?" "I almost lost my sister." His voice wasn't dramatic. It was tired. "I kept thinking about something you said." "What?" "Urgent doesn't erase permission." He looked out across the backyard. "I've repeated that sentence to myself more times than you know." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he turned toward me. "I'm not asking you to trust me again." "I know." "I'm just trying to become someone who deserves it someday." That was probably the most honest thing Marcus had ever said to me. Not because it guaranteed anything, because it expected nothing. When I left that evening, my mother handed me a small wooden box. "I think this belongs with you." Inside was my grandmother's compass. The same antique brass compass she had carried during road trips with Grandpa decades earlier. Months earlier, it had briefly become part of the legal dispute because my parents had listed nearly every valuable family item while preparing financial documents. Daniel eventually removed it from the case after proving it had always been intended for me through my grandmother's estate notes. I smiled. "You kept it safe?" Mom nodded. "I wanted to give it back myself." I accepted it, not because it erased the past, because it closed one final chapter. Over the next year, my business continued growing. We hired 5 employees, expanded into neighboring states, opened a second office. The $150,000 that almost disappeared became the foundation for something far larger than I'd originally imagined. Sometimes clients asked why I was so careful with contracts, why I insisted every decision be documented, why every authorization required clear written approval. I usually smiled and said, "Experience." That answer was always enough. My relationship with my parents slowly became respectful, though never as close as it once seemed. We spoke occasionally, shared birthdays, celebrated holidays, but they no longer had access to my financial life. They didn't know my account balances, my investments, my contracts, or my business decisions. Those boundaries weren't punishment. They were protection. Marcus rebuilt his construction company one project at a time, without shortcuts, without expecting family rescues. The process took years. I respected that far more than I ever respected his earlier success. One afternoon, almost exactly a year after the attempted wire transfer, Rebecca Mitchell called. "I thought you'd like to know." "What happened?" "The compliance investigation has officially been closed." She emailed me the final confirmation while we spoke. The subject line read, "Investigation closed. No further action required." I opened the attachment. There it was. The final bank confirmation. The case was permanently closed. No outstanding claims, no unresolved disputes, no pending reviews, Just one final sentence acknowledging that the disputed transaction had never been completed. I thanked Rebecca before ending the call. Then I placed the printed confirmation inside a folder with every other document from the past year: the screenshots, the emails, the settlement agreement, the scanner logs, the compliance reports. Not because I expected to need them again, because they reminded me of something I'll never forget. Evidence doesn't shout. It waits. Truth doesn't always arrive first. Sometimes it arrives one document, one conversation, and one patient decision at a time. The attempted wire transfer never defined my future. The boundaries I built afterward did. And that more than any courtroom settlement or investigation became the greatest victory of all. Family betrayal often doesn't begin with hatred. It begins with rationalization. Someone convinces themselves that a temporary shortcut is justified, that the responsible person can handle it, or that the ends will eventually excuse the means. Those beliefs can slowly blur the line between love and controlled generosity and entitlement. If you've ever been treated as the dependable one in your family, I hope this story reminds you that healthy boundaries are not acts of revenge. Saying no to financial manipulation doesn't mean you love your family less. It means you respect yourself enough to protect what you've worked hard to build. Forgiveness when it comes is a personal choice. But forgiveness does not require restoring the same access, the same trust, or the same financial authority to people who have already violated it. Trust can be rebuilt only through consistent actions over time, never through pressure or guilt. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your peace and protecting someone else's expectations? Share your experience in the comments. You never know who might feel less alone because of your words. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family resilience, justice, and healing, consider subscribing so we can continue these conversations together. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.